Welcome back. This time we are with Mark Chandler. He is managing director at Barron Capital Markets. He's also a college professor. The author of an article that is going to appear in Barron's pretty soon about precisely the importance of demography and capital. Assuming that we are leading to a great moderation, is that this going to be a time of low growth with low interest rates. I got to address also that issue in this interview. Um, uh, but let me start with something more that comes from current events. That is that, as you know, recently Trump has moved to fire the Federal Reserve Governor Cook, and this comes after he tried to fire Powell by cause in September 25. And this comes also after he fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in August 1st, which is clearly this marks a trend trying to tame the Federal Reserve, not differently from Nixon did with the Federal Reserve in 1972. So, and let's consider that the board has 7 members. That the message seems to have been very clear, because now, despite the increase of the IPP, the producer index, the index producer of the inflation index, the indicator that reflects inflation among producers, despite it having risen 0.9% in just 1 month, now Powell seems hesitant about avoiding a interest rate cut. So, is this what it seems? A trend to tame institutions, or?
No, you raise a very important point that's really weighing on market sentiment for U.S. assets, and this is about President Trump's governing style and his belief in this unified executive, meaning that the president should be able to do what he wants to do. And I think that, Europe, a famous British political philosopher, Lord Acton, once said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I know many people agree with this, but I think that the US contribution to political philosophy goes against this. I would cite Federalist 10, which was a set of papers, the Federalist Papers, that were designed to really try to convince the Americans back when the US was only 13 struggling colonies fighting the greatest empire at the time. And in the Federalist Papers, one of the defenses of America's philosophy, political philosophy that was emerging, was about checks and balances. And it works on the basis of ambition, of the best way to check one group of power, like the executive branch, is the ambition of the legislative branch, Congress, or the power of other agencies like the Supreme Court, for example. So I agree with you that that President Trump has tried to get control of parts of the larger government that does not really report to him directly. But I don't think it's going to be successful. For example, you mentioned the dismissal of Federal Reserve Governor Cook. She is opposing this. She's going to take President Trump to court and sue him, claiming that there was no cause. Cause has a specific meaning when we talk about employment practices. Typically, cause implies some misconduct or incompetence at the job itself. What she's accused of, and again, she's being accused of without a trial, without a hearing, without a defense on her own part to explain the circumstances. The cause in this case, President Trump is citing, happened possibly years before she became a Federal Reserve governor. So it's possible that the court upholds the independence of the Federal Reserve and denies the president the authority to fire her. That is to say, that cause does not exist. And like you mentioned, President Trump has tried to pressure Powell into resigning, even though he seemed to have forgotten that he, President Trump, had nominated uh, Powell to be the chair because he said that the former chair, Janet Yellen, was too short. And the other thing I would caution against is the idea that just because the president makes a nomination or makes the appointment, that those people always follow what he wants. For example, Governor Waller, who recently dissented from the recent FOMC meeting to keep rates on hold, was appointed by President Trump to the governor as governor, but through most of this time until this past meeting, Waller was seen as one of the hawks. He is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve has not cut interest rates. And so I think that we have to decide as individuals about the integrity of other individuals.
And wouldn't you agree that the best message the Federal Reserve could send to Trump is not cutting interest rates in the next meeting?
No, I think that to me, what it means is that the Federal Reserve is an independent agency. It has to decide for itself on the conduct of its policy. And I think that the reason the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates in September is not because of President Trump. I think that it's irrelevant what President Trump says for the Federal Reserve's decision making next month. I think that the reason that the Federal Reserve is going to cut interest rates is, as Powell indicated, the risks between the two mandates the Federal Reserve has appears to have shifted. The bigger threat to the economy right now seems to be coming from slowing of the labor market broadly, not so much because of prices. I understand prices are elevated. The Federal Reserve obviously recognizes that prices are elevated, but it's got the two mandates, full employment, price stability. And it thinks that up until now, the employment market, the economy as a whole, has been strong enough to allow the Federal Reserve to have a restrictive monetary policy to push inflation down. But because of the deterioration of the labor market, those risks are changing. And so the Federal Reserve is not going to be easing policy. It's going to be reducing the restrictiveness of the current policy setting.
Yes, and yet the risk of increase in prices, whether it is as a form of inflation or just a one installment discrete increase in prices because of tariffs, was there before. And when confronted with this fact, Powell said that his priority would be price stability, and now it seems he may change that. The upsetting part is after Trump's threat to job to.
I think that you're right. It comes after Trump's threat, but more importantly, it comes after a deterioration in the labor market. The unemployment rate not only went up, and here's what's going to happen too. By the time that the Federal Reserve meets again next month, it's going to have not only another batch of jobs data and the early forecast for non-farm payrolls for this month, which gets reported on September 5th, is about 85,000. And the unemployment rate is expected to go up another tenth of a percent. And a few days later, the US government is going to announce the annual benchmark revisions to the non-farm payroll. And what it's going to likely do is revise lower the job growth of the past year. So the Federal Reserve will be presented with data at the upcoming meeting that shows, to your point, somewhat higher price pressures and a weaker labor market. The Federal Reserve has been clear about this. As the economy weakens, as the labor market deteriorates, that itself will help push down prices because it's going to weaken demand.
Now, moving to the kind of economy we can expect to from Trump. it seems it's not a market economy, but a kind of crony capitalism. I'm trying. I have to be frank. So we see, for instance, the bigger companies getting exemptions from tariffs. So tariffs are not for the top companies who can get access to Trump, but for everybody else. We see that the bigger companies in the Standard and Poor 500 are rising in value much more than the rest of the index. So we see this kind of growth that is typical of emerging markets, where you have basically two economies moving in tandem than from the kind of the economies, the great moderation would expect, right?
No, I mean, I think the U.S. has long had a dual economy where you had a large monopolistic or oligopolistic core part of the economy, highly concentrated. And then you've got the periphery, small and medium-sized businesses. Those small and medium-sized businesses still hire roughly half of the U.S. labor force. I agree with you. The stock market is highly concentrated in a handful of names. That's true. I'm not so sure that I see this as crony capitalism quite yet. And I don't think that references to the U.S. as being like a third world country or an emerging market economy really is. I think that these are like words that excite people. But when you really dig below the surface, I don't think that really holds up. And to your point, President Trump has announced that he's taken a 10% stake in Intel. And some people say, well, this is part of this crony capitalism. But I'm not so sure that's the case. I mean, look, most countries, think about it in Europe, the countries own parts of industry, whether they're car companies, banks, other types of state-owned ownership. This is an exception in the U.S. Trump is breaking the general tradition. Usually, going back even to World War I, Woodrow Wilson nationalized the railroads. People knew we weren't socialist. Of course, this is the time of around World War I is the time when the Russians had their revolution. The U.S. wasn't going down the socialist route, and after the war ended, the railroads were privatized again. During the great financial crisis and the bankruptcy of the U.S. auto companies, the U.S. government took a stake. And as the economy recovered, the companies recovered, the banks recovered, they sold back their stakes. And so, the other point I'd make is that the Trump administration, so far at least, they say they're taking a 10% stake in Intel. It doesn't look like it's going to be a voting stake. And so instead of basically loaning them the money under the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration proposed, the Trump administration takes the equity. And I'm not so sure that that is a bad decision for American consumers and the American economy. Why should it, previously I'd say we called it lemon socialism, where troubled companies were bailed out. And as the companies recovered, we basically privatized profits again. And this time, I'm not so sure that that's the right decision. That socializing the profits after socializing the bailout seems to be a fairer way to do things.
Mm, with respect to that, yeah, so it's very debatable because is different, but not that different from what Biden did. Practically, what Trump has done is to convert those grants into a share in the company. The problem is that that is still very far from an industrial policy. Considering, for instance, the comparison with Taiwan, it's true, the government took a stake from the very foundation of the chips companies. But it is not here, it's not like here where Trump just take a stake of a company after the fact. So you have to grow. For instance, there is a critical factor that is completely absent, both here and in the Plaza Accord, on which he supposedly is basing his industrial policy, that is investment in research and development. On that, we are still depending on the big companies. instead of creating this pool that was possible, for instance, in the times of the race space from Kennedy, the space of investment in basic hard science.
Yes, what you say is true, and this is, I think, this is going to a big mistake on the U.S.'s part. It's going to keep us from being as competitive as we could be. Other countries, including China, are going to surpass us in this basic research, and we can see this in the number of patents. We can see this in growth areas, leaving aside the semiconductor chips, which is really a legacy. But you look at the sort of the new technologies, whether it's solar, whether it's the EVs, whether it's combining AI and robotics. I think that whether it's the cuts that the U.S. has done to the National Institutes of Health, these are all things that I think are going to undermine the U.S.'s competitiveness in the future.
And that's a big problem because instead of creating this transparent investment in, for instance, what we need, investment in, for instance, in fusion, in the case of MIT, or carbon capture, also in the case of MIT, we are giving money to a company that is going to always be tempted to make side deals in order to make internal decisions about payment to executives and others.
I worry,
That,
I worry about what this means for the future, but I'm not sure that in the very short term, like what we have to talk about now is longer term, medium term, and longer term implications. But in the short term, for the stock market, for the dollar, for U.S. interest rates, I'm not sure that these structural forces are biting quite yet. I think people are still resistant to it, and I think that they're not sure what happens. Trump, of course, has been elected for 4 years, but that's all, 4 years. And so what happens in 2028 might be more important for the long-term competitiveness of the U.S. than what happens this week or next week.
and that's what I would have them to jump to. If you are an economic agent right now, you plan to you have to consider the Trump's policies, but then you wonder what are you going to do with, after 2029 if Democrats come back to power. But Democrats are still playing dead, and that's a huge problem. And it's not that they don't have legacies on which they could base a economic message. I prefer the FDR's message, but you also have to reinvent government, reimagine government from Al Gore. So you have two valid legacies on which you can find, for instance, a counter narrative in the case of government with respect to Dodge, and yet they are doing nothing. So if you're an economic agent, what do you expect in 2029 if Democrats come back to power?
I think you raise an important point, and that is that the U.S. has lost trust and confidence. I think it's really about the American brand, which has been soiled. And I mean, how much it's been soiled just in the past 8 months or so. So I think that's going to be a problem to regain the trust. So even if someone gets elected in 2028 and says, they come out from, they're more the East Coast or West Coast internationalists as opposed to this nationalist camp of Trump's, that I'm not sure that foreign investors, foreign governments, U.S. allies can trust the U.S. if it's only 4 years away from another Trump. So I think some of the damage was going to be semi-permanent. But at the same time, I think that many countries, and not just countries, but also U.S. companies, U.S. universities, are sort of they're making a trade, sort of like a Pascal's wager. What they're doing, I think, is they're betting that the cost is upfront, whether it's the tariffs or other trade sanctions, the disruption that the U.S. is causing right now. They're willing to sacrifice this by not fighting back very much, whether it's the EU, Canada just retracted some of its retaliatory tariffs. Um, I think that countries and companies, universities are willing to, in the short run, take a hit, do what the president wants, and hope to avoid a bigger confrontation, a more costly confrontation, and thinking that they can outlast Trump.
But I will ask for what? That's the question. Because if Democrats come back to power, what are they going to propose? A light version of Trump or what?
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear yet with the direction things are going. The Democrats, I mean, it's still. I think we have to get past next year's midterm election, and I think a clearer picture will emerge. We're already seeing President Trump's policies eroding his own support. And so it seems to me that what's going to happen is the Democrats, the opposition in the U.S. political system, will find its voice, but it still might be a year away or more before they find this voice. And this is also why the bet to make is really avoid steeper confrontation, more costly confrontation with President Trump, acquiesce in the short run, and look for opportunities to improve the situation in the medium to longer term.
But if you see voter registration right now, that could backfire because people are still not regretting. They don't like Trump, but they are still not regretting their vote because they don't see anything on the side of Democrats. And
You're right. The Democrats, I mean, only recently has the California Governor Newsom uh, uh, taken like a more aggressive approach. We have an election coming up in New York City that also seems to be a refutation of the direction that Trump wants to take the country. I think that we are seeing from almost every constituency group that voted for President Trump, we're seeing that support erode. And especially what's going to be key, I think, are the independents. People who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, or in New York voted for AOC and voted for Trump. It's those people that I think are be the key in the next election, and I think that they're being turned off by the current administration.
now, that brings me to the redistributional effects of Trump's policies. Both the case of tariffs and the case of mass deportations that have a more focused effect on agriculture and construction. The problem is that by the time the redistributional, for instance, if you see the jail lab, the most significant effects of Trump's tariffs are not on GDP, are on income distribution. The less decile, the lowest decile suffers the most.
Yes.
So it affects the most precisely the demographics that abandoned the Democratic Party in 2024. And that brings me that if I come after the fact saying, oh, this happened, I'm going to look detached. I have to get behind. I cannot go after the car. I have to go before the car. So I have to arrive before the car. Otherwise, I'm going to look detached or unprepared or something like that. So that's why I believe the Democratic Party should be taking chances because it's precisely the redistributional effects what are going to, and what happens if all the uncertainty Trump is creating because he wants to go to the back to the McKinley times, fires back and creates an overreaction. If there is a financial crisis, you will have not very little resources to help precisely those lower deciles that are suffering the most because of Trump policies. And if Democrats look like detached, surprised spectators instead of participants, active participants, that's not going to wage well for them in 2026.
I think that you raise a very important point, and that is, I think, a confusion. Not only, I think it's really a confusion more for non-Americans than it is for Americans. And the confusion stems from thinking that we have two political parties in the United States and that they ought to be different. But you know, there's this economic like paradox. Imagine that you are on a hot beach and there is one ice cream stand, and you decide you're going to open up another ice cream stand. Where is the logical place to open up that ice cream stand? On the other side of the beach, away from the first ice cream stand? No. It turns out that logically, the best place to open your ice cream stand is right next to the other one. You get the externalities, the spillover, a long line in his, so they come over to yours. Political parties work the same way. You talk about the disparity of wealth and income in the United States, and yet that continued, intensified under Democrats like the Clintons and the Obamas and Biden. And so the problem is that in the US, we really have one political party. It's the capitalist political party. And the difference between Republicans and Democrats tends to be what we'd call the hubris of small differences. Of course, as a person in the United States, I would like to, I have an idea what the Supreme Court should be like or the Federal Reserve should be like. But on a lot of issues, Republicans and Democrats share views. The hostility towards China, the temptation to play with law and order issues. So I think that the problem is that we have two political parties, and both of them have overseen a concentration of wealth and power and income in the United States. But the idea is uh, that the one is still maybe more intense than the other. For example, under President Biden, we had an expansionary social program. We had a active antitrust uh, Federal Trade Commission. We had various other social programs and efforts that seem to, at least on the margins, curtail some of the power and unilateral action of capital, including like an active National Labor Relations Board, who President Trump has dismissed several people from. So I fully accept your analysis that right now it doesn't look like Americans will have much of a choice, whether it's in 2026 or 2028. And I'm counting on really coming from really this back to this Federalist 10, that in order to check the power of the executive, some other branches of government, like Congress, like the judiciary, and the markets, are rising to check the power. The Democrats need to have their own vision, and I think that the loss to President Trump in 2024 is going to help invigorate that debate among the Democrats for a new vision. This sounds a bit optimistic, given that right now it doesn't seem like it's happening. No leader has really come up that's going to be able to capture the imagination of these people who feel disenfranchised by the current administration.
Yes, but the problem of following just leaders is that it leads us to this. What I mentioned is that we have the Republican Party and the light version of the Republican Party, that is the Democratic Party, but we don't have like something like the Roosevelt's FDR, Roosevelt's New Deal, so a different restructure, because the institutions have pretty much gone through two stages in the queue. First, Hamilton, that who built the financial system that was then dismantled by Jefferson and others until Jackson, and then we have FDR, who created this new framework with a new role for government. In the
But
case
remember,
of in the case
remember
of
that
in the case of of Democrats, what passes for the left is Mandani. So and that's very sad, because if Mandani fails with his populist policies, that's going to entrench and make stronger the trend of the Democratic Party of becoming the light version of the Republican Party.
what concerns me, though, is, I too think that Franklin Roosevelt was among the best U.S. presidents. But remember what's happened. A large part of his program was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. He wanted to stack the Supreme Court in the same way that President Trump has talked about trying to stack the Federal Reserve Board. Roosevelt was elected 4 times in a row, unprecedented in American history. This was happening, of course, as parts of Europe and Japan were experiencing fascism. So America didn't go down the fascist route, but we did have a president who tried to pursue unconstitutional goals, tried to stack the Supreme Court, and stayed in office well beyond what other presidents had done before then. I fully accept that the New Deal changed things in the United States, and then further progress by Kennedy and Johnson with the Great Society and the civil rights reforms in the U.S. in the 1960s. I think that since 1980 or so, there's been an attempt to rein that back, to try to unwind parts of the New Deal, to unwind, whether it's Social Security, unemployment compensation, making things more difficult for people, for the common people of the United States. I share that view, but I don't think we should romanticize what happened under FDR, and that in some ways President Trump is exploring the power of the executive branch, which has evolved since Franklin Roosevelt, the power of the presidency. You know, many people like myself who came to like political age during the Watergate thought that that crisis would curtail the power of the presidency. A person during John F. Kennedy's term, an advisor to Kennedy, wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency. This is almost 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago, the book was written. And so here we are today talking about the imperial US presidency again. Again, though, I think that's sort of like toothpaste coming out of the tube. Once it,
But in the case of oh, sorry. But in the case of Roosevelt, so the parts of the New Deal that were struck down by the Supreme Court were the initial part, the more experimental part of the New Deal, is because the New Deal started basically taking its final shape after the recession of 1937. And let's not remember that the Supreme Court, at least he could, yeah, it's questionable, I admit it, but at least he fought for what he had a very adverse Supreme Court. Even there were these four far right justices that were called the Four Horsemen, and he at least fought against that instead of Biden, who meekly accepted and avoided any kind of confrontation with the Supreme Court, and so he self-mutilated his own programs. So it's, but yeah, I admit it, but he, at least people saw, and probably something very important is that different from Mandani, who tries to create government programs to protect people from the imperfections of the market. Aside from relief due to the depression, the goal of FDR was to make markets less imperfect. His accent was in unionization, giving power to workers, and in precisely increasing competition that comes after precisely that part that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So that's why I'm so discouraged by this current Democratic Party. There is not a message of opportunity. There is a message of benefits, not opportunity. That was what made FDR so great. He even considered many of those benefits the dole. And that's what, for instance, I am so discouraged with respect to this Democratic Party.
I mean, I think you touched on something that's important. There's a U.S. Historian, Lewis Hartz, who argues that because the U.S. did not have a feudal past, it cannot have a socialist future. The U.S. is one of the only countries that do not have an active Green Party of any note. You know, I had worked on the Citizens Party in 1980. Barry Commoner, who was a great environmentalist in the United States, was running for president. He had no chance to win. I worked on that campaign, knowing full well he didn't have a chance to win, but we don't have that tradition in the U.S. And so the challenge, I think, is how to expand the rights you get as a citizen for being in a rich country. What are they? One of the rights you get, one of the things you get, that basket of goods, you get public education. for example. You get a highway system, you get roads. What we don't have, I think, is a better system of redistribution that Europe has, for example. The social safety net in the US is my concern, is that I think the biggest threat to the United States right now is not what I'd call encroachment, another country eating America's lunch, but I think it's abdication, where the US gives up its leadership, partly in the world stage, but partly even here at home. I think that this disparity of wealth and income is like this corrosive acid that eats away at social institutions and relationships. And so I don't see neither party in the United States really addressing that. I'm hopeful that as a response to President Trump, that the Democrats find the vision of a more equal society. But I'm afraid that what's happened is that people right now are so protective of liberty. And by liberty, I don't mean freedom. Liberty, I mean the rights of property. People are worried that if they have their rights of property eroded, that somehow they won't be able to move up in the social climb. When I was teaching at NYU in the School of Continuing and Professional Studies, I would often ask my students, if tomorrow the US government decided that we have too many breakfast cereals, it was a waste. That from now on there would be three breakfast cereals, something like Cheerios that doesn't get soggy in milk, some kind of flake thing that gets soggy in milk, and then some other kind of tree-hugging granola cereal. I said, if you only had a choice between three cereals, how many people would think that there would be less free? And oftentimes, three-quarters or more of my students would say that they're less free. America is finding freedom, what they think is freedom, in the range of consumer goods that they can access. And I'm afraid that the real meaning of freedom that the founders of America believed in, as well as the ancient Greeks, self-determination. And I think we're losing that, and we're sacrificing this idea of freedom for the sake of liberty. We're sacrificing equality for the sake of liberty. And I think we're reaching a point where people will begin willing to give up their liberties.
That's what brings to mind that precisely the three items that have grown the most, and that have absorbed most of Americans' purchasing power are rent, healthcare, and education. Three markets that are by themselves imperfect. The matter is that democratic policy has always aimed to not to correct the imperfections of those three markets, but try to ameliorate the effects through fiscal credits or tax credits or any kinds of other benefits. Healthcare is a very imperfect system. Rent housing is limited by NIMBYism, and the case of education, practically we have a two-tier system. If you go to an Ivy League, it's a different market for you. If you go to other educational options, you have a different kind of market where you survive practically to pay your student loans. So, and that's another defect of the message in the Democratic Party.
I think that to me, what you just point out is that the Democrats aren't socialists. That socialism still hasn't, the way that Europe defines socialism hasn't taken root in the United States. And the Democratic Party are not socialists, they're capitalists. There is a social democratic wing, but it's a very small minority.
But in the case of the healthcare, let's remember that it was Bismarck in Germany who started the healthcare system, because precisely they wanted to prevent workers from being tempted precisely by socialist ideas. Here,
Now, I don't know about that. I think that Bismarck, like Abraham Lincoln in the United States, began the welfare state, and it grew out of trying to take care of widows and orphans from a war. Not trying to, they weren't, I don't think that Bismarck was a socialist. I don't think Abraham Lincoln was a socialist.
no,
I think
no,
these
they were
programs,
capitalists, as FDR was a capitalist, but they were convinced that if workers didn't have a stake in the system, they would be tempted by socialist ideas.
I don't think that was about workers. I think the original welfare state grew out of help for widows and orphans, victims of a war. The Civil War in the US's case, and there was several wars in Germany that Bismarck oversaw. And I think that that's to me the interesting thing is the modern welfare state did not grow out of a desire for philanthropic activity or fairness for workers. This was
Yeah.
before workers were really even organized. This was really for widows and orphans. And what we've done, both in the US and Europe, is extended that, continue to expand who qualifies for this basket of goods. We've gone from widows and orphans to, say, less economically or more economically disadvantaged people, for example, or trying to have a tax policy that's progressive, that taxes rich people at a higher rate than poorer people or lower income people. But these are add-ons to something that began in the 19th century. And but here we are, early 21st century, and we have, I mean, these programs are still, whether you look at Germany, or you look at the United States, the disparity of wealth on a pre-tax basis is huge. But I think I share your point that for me, the essential goods that we need at this moment in time for a person to be integrated into society, healthcare, education, legal advice to protect their rights, home ownership, these four things are increasingly beyond the reach of most Americans. So they take on debt, and not just college loan debt, but right now we have a very high delinquency rate in all kinds of consumer borrowings, not only mortgages, car loans, student loans, credit cards, and this is what typically happens in the U.S. before we have a crisis, a recession that washes some of this away. But this is a problem, but I don't think it's unique to America. I just think the problem is most acute in America.
But yes, what I meant is that the Democrats have always been terrorized by the labels of socialistic or if besides Bismarck in Canada, their health system was created by a conservative government, so they don't have to be socialist ideas. Because they were created originally to counter precisely the temptation of socialist ideas. So, but and yet Democrats are unable to fight even that.
I mean, we do have a nascent national healthcare program in the U.S. We're very late at the game. Most other countries, especially when you think about the U.S. wealth, GDP per capita, most other countries that are even close to American GDP per capita have a more extensive program for national health care, but also education, legal rights. And so, yes, I fully agree with the criticism of the U.S. I'm not sure that the Democrats have the vision yet to fix it. I agree with you there as well. But I think that some solution is going to have to be forthcoming, or we're going to have greater social discord.
But now I want to move to your article.
Okay.
Uh, in your article, you seem to assume that we have rational economic agents that are going to converge to, after many ups and downs created by episodes like the pandemic or others, to a long-term trend of low growth and low interest rates. But the problem is that we don't have those, in my opinion. I believe Krugman also shares that belief, that we don't have those rational economic agents. And that's why if you don't have institutions to set the rails so they that cannot deviate brusquely from that trend we all want because it's a desirable trend. Or well, like what happened with Hamilton or Roosevelt, we get episodes like what we had in the 19th century with the railroads. Lots of capital wasted because they were creating multiple lines that instead of sharing the same line. Uh, let's remember that in the case of FDR, we didn't have, after in the next 60, 70 years, we didn't have any major bubble, any major crisis. And after this, what these rules were started to be relaxed, starting with not just with Reagan, but with the previous Democratic president, and we started to see all kind of things that we had not seen since before Roosevelt. And my question is, right now the growth is basically pushed by artificial intelligence data centers. If this bubble doesn't get results um, in time, if they don't get results in its results in time, they may them be the data centers are still going to be there, but the companies may not. And is that going to look more like the telecom crisis of the 1990s, or like the railroads crisis of the 19th century? Because that depends a lot of the kind of institutions we have, institutions which are being challenged by Trump precisely.
So let me work through through your question.
Mhm,
First, let's say that uh, about the rational actor. I think
mhm.
you raise a good point that it's hard to really to count on the rationality of other people, let alone ourselves. And we see this also, behavioral finance pushes against this idea of the rationality of the economic agent as individuals. We have prejudices, all kinds of logical fallacies that we typically do. But I think that the way that a cup of coffee cools off in a laboratory is a little bit different than the way it cools off at my desk. But still, that what happens in that laboratory still seems to be a reasonable uh, model for what happens. And similarly, while of course we are not always rational on a number of different grounds, but it offers us a uh, a model that seems to be, while not perfect, it seems to capture the essence of what happens. And to me, the this essence is a twofold. One is that what I see happening in the world still is that in this world in which capital, call it capitalism, capital dominates. But there's so much of it. That's why in my work, I think that the biggest problem of capitalism are not these problems that can be reformed away. Like in the 19th century, people said, oh, you couldn't have capitalism without slavery. Voila, we can show that we do. Said, well, you couldn't have slavery if women could read and vote. Voila, 20th century, we showed that that's not true either. Same thing with child labor. Same thing with ruining the environment. So what's the essence of capitalism, I think, is not the threat by these things that can be fixed, but rather by its own success. Capitalism produces wealth in unimaginable levels. And I think that what's happened is that just like back when the in the early days of the pandemic, oil prices went below zero. Incredible. And oil prices below the cost of below zero. You had to pay someone to pick up the oil from your field. Incredible. And yet we know what happened. The supply was so much greater than the demand. So now I say there's nothing special about capital. Let's apply that same rule, the same law of supply and demand to capital. And what do we find? The Swiss have zero policy rate right now, interest rate, zero. And the market is betting, that is the swaps market, the interest rate market is assuming that interest rates are going to go below zero, policy rate below zero in Switzerland this year. Their 2-year note. You want someplace safe to invest your money? The Swiss charge you 20 basis points to lend it to them. And so in my way of thinking, then this is only possible. And we could broaden it because even Japan, their inflation is near 3%, and their overnight interest rate is at 50 basis points. That's the real rate. So one way to calculate the real rate, take the nominal rate, subtract inflation from it, and you have a real rate. That we have negative real interest rates in many countries tells me that we have too much capital. That is to
I
say, 19th century version of not just in Europe, but also in the United States, surplus capital drives the price down.
I agree that the capitalism is the best tool for growth, but it also has self-destructive tendencies. For instance, monopolistic tendencies that were curtailed by Teddy Roosevelt, the tendencies to speculative investment over leverages that were led to the crisis of the 29 and also to the of 2008. So that's why institutions are needed as guardrails, as limits, parameters that the capital should not cross in order to prevent what we know is already, because of history, that is self-destructive. But on the rest, I completely agree. So it's basically in the long term, if we have put these guardrails, the tendency should be to precisely what you mentioned in the Great Moderation.
I think that the problem is right now is that we've seen this happen now in our lifetime, that after the 08, 09 great financial crisis, new regulations were imposed, these guardrails that you spoke of. And then years pass by and people forget about why we have those in the first place and they begin dismantling it. And that's where we are now, that we need for this capital to go around the world. And, I specialize in the foreign exchange market, and the average daily turnover is about $7.5 trillion. $7.5 trillion. That means that in about 3 weeks, there's enough turnover in the foreign exchange market to buy everything the world produces in a year. World trade is only about $35 trillion a year, and we do that in a week in the foreign exchange market. This just gives you a sense of this huge amount of money circulating around the globe, this hot money sloshing around looking for short-term profit opportunities. In order for that to be sustainable, the pipes that they move in have to be very strong. But what we're finding is the pipes aren't really that strong, partly because every so often the people who are being regulated capture their regulators. In the US, we consider campaign finance as part of freedom of speech. And so businesses have dominated the agenda, and they see it sometimes in their interest to thin the pipes, deregulate, lower the guardrails. And I think that's what sets us up for the next crisis. It's sort of like what Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, teaches up at Columbia now. And he said during the great financial crisis, he said, what we want is a prize fight. But instead, we get a barroom brawl without a strong referee and strong rules. And so I'm not sure about last year the people who got the Nobel Prize of Economics did their work about institutions. But I'm just not talking about institutions. I'm talking about how one institution, like businesses, capital, can capture another institution, Congress, for example. And even now, there are ETFs, exchange traded funds, that track what both Republican Congress people and what Democrat Congress people are doing, trading. And we have judges that are allowed to trade too. I think the level of corruptness in the US is another element that spoils the US brand. It's not just about institutions. These are perfectly legal practices that the Congress people and judges do. So I think that the problem is systemic in the US, but I do think that we have too much capital in the sense globally, which is going to push down interest rates. And we've got this other issue that I discuss is this dearth of births. It turns out the best form of birth control is urbanization. You look at the fertility rates. I mean, people worry about China invading Taiwan. Taiwan has stopped reproducing. Their population is shrinking at a very fast rate, faster than China's. They're going to need China 20 years from now in a way that will be amazing to people, will surprise people, because Taiwan is shrinking. Japan is shrinking. If it wasn't for immigrants in the US population would also be shrinking. It will be shortly. And so, to me, those two things, those two big forces, surplus capital and this low fertility rate, is going to point to an era that lies ahead of slow growth, And in slow growth times, you typically have lower inflation, lower interest rates, lower profitability.
No, I have to consider that the institutions, if they are not transparent, they are going to be obviously captured and they are just painted in the wall. But if they are transparent, like in the times of FDR, mm, companies start to align, to get in line. But let me leave you the last word in this interview because I know you have something else to do in a few minutes. And probably you can tell us something about your book, the new book you are preparing.
Sure, when I was a young man, I used to be like critical of artists who do something really bold, and then they spend the rest of their life exploring their boldness, not really expanding to new territory. And I'm afraid that I've done the same thing. In my first two books and this third book I'm working on, really looks at the surplus capital argument. A person who I really use a lot from, I learned about in graduate school at Northern Illinois University, where I studied American history. And this person, his name is Charles Conant. He's a journalist, but also an advisor to presidents around the turn of the century, early 20th century. He has this vision. To me, he's sort of like he's read Marx. He understands the surplus capital problem. But he also is anticipating Keynes. Ultimately, what Conan says, which applies, I think, to the United States today, but also to China. He says there's so much capital that's forcing profits to go down. We need to do something with that. His solution was twofold. One is a social safety net, things like unemployment compensation, social security, various social programs to help underpin consumption. But he knew that that was not going to be enough. He also suggested then exporting that extra savings to help build infrastructure in other countries. It's not that kind of portfolio investment that you or I or some of your viewers might do, buying stocks or bonds in a foreign country. It is about buying ownership, building an infrastructure, railroads, docks, wharfs, piers, electricity grids. This infrastructure was going to create markets that then could buy goods from the metropolis, from this case the U.S. or from Europe. And so I look again at this guy Charles Conant and trying to explore the implications of his ideas. And one of them I'm working on is really the old, you're probably familiar with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That after an individual has food and shelter, they can think about other things, including at the top of the pyramid, if you will,
Mhm.
top of the hierarchy, self-actualization. And what I'm suggesting is that capitalism has been so successful that one of the things it's done, it's created other interests that rival the interests of capital, like social justice or the environment. And now that for two or three generations in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, even if not the whole thing, people have had food and shelter for a while, several generations. And because of that, I think we can move up Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and look at other things. So the tentative title of the book was originally going to be called The End of Economic Primacy, thinking that these other issues, I mean, think about New York State has the geological formation for fracking. But the citizens of New York say we don't want to do that because it hurts the environment. And so that's just an example of where the importance of economics and profitability and economic efficiency are being eclipsed by other things. In this case, the environment or sustainability issues. And so, even though I'm kind of pessimistic in our discussion here today about the future, about what the Democrats can do to propose something that really changes the the disparity of wealth and income in the U.S. in a way that they haven't done since you say Franklin Roosevelt or maybe JFK and Johnson. But even though I'm pessimistic about that, I'm more optimistic that capital itself is going to be superseded. The importance that we give to capital, we should keep it on a pedestal. But I think gradually, as it becomes in greater surplus in a chronic fashion, its interests become less significant.
Well, It's practically no, so we have to end. But I want to thank you for your participation. Hopefully, we can continue that discussion. This discussion in a month or two. Probably by then your book is already published in the bookshelves. For now, I only can thank you for again for your participation and looking forward to the next time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and good luck to everybody.
Okay, thank you.